When a black elderly woman is slapped by a store clerk in front of silent bystanders, the town erupts in rage. But the real shock comes when the clerk learns who truly owns the store. What begins as an assault spirals into a reckoning generations in the making of power, race, and legacy. The morning sun filtered through the tinted front windows of Gold Market Grocery, throwing soft beams of light across the waxed tile floor as shoppers moved lazily through the aisles, baskets in hand, muttering over prices and checking their phones. It was an ordinary Wednesday in the quiet suburban town of Elm Ridge, a place where silence carried more power than words, and familiarity often disguised indifference. Behind the front counter, Stephanie Monroe adjusted the small security mirror above her register, glancing at the steady trickle of customers with the mix of boredom and control that came with 5 years in retail. She wasn't rude, at least not intentionally, but there was a sharpness to her demeanor, a practiced edge honed by hundreds of shifts dealing with rudeness, theft, and entitlement. Yet none of that justified what happened next, and deep inside, she would remember that forever. The bell over the entrance jingled lightly as a small figure walked in. Miss Thelma Dupree, age 79, wearing her Sunday hat and moving with slow, deliberate steps. She was well known in Elm Ridge, not for being wealthy or loud, but because she was always present. Rain or shine, she walked from her small bungalow 3 blocks away, usually humming an old hymn, her cane tapping the pavement in time with her memories. Today, she needed flour, milk, and a new box of tea bags. What she didn't know was that her presence alone would trigger something ugly in a town too polite to admit its sins. Stephanie watched her enter, her eyes narrowing imperceptibly. There was something about the woman's calm confidence that irritated her, though she couldn't explain why. Miss Thelma moved slowly but directly to aisle 4, stopping to examine the baking goods. She wasn't in a rush, and why should she be? Her grandkids weren't coming until the weekend. She reached for a bag of flour, checked the label with care, then began her careful shuffle back to the front, unaware that her every movement was being watched not just by Stephanie, but by the store's one dusty security camera. Stephanie stepped away from the register as Miss Thelma approached the counter. "That all?" she asked sharply. Miss Thelma nodded gently, her smile unbothered by the tone. "Yes, dear, just these today." Stephanie rang up the items, tapping her long nails against the screen. When Miss Thelma pulled out a worn coin purse, struggling slightly with the clasp, Stephanie sighed audibly and muttered under her breath. Another customer in line raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The purse finally opened and Miss Thelma counted exact change, placing each coin carefully in Stephanie's palm. "Would you like a bag?" Stephanie asked, already irritated. "No, thank you," Miss Thelma replied. "I brought mine." She held up a faded floral tote. Then, as if realizing something, she leaned forward. "I think you might have overcharged me for the flour. It says $2.49 on the shelf, but you rang up $2.99. The request was simple, polite, factual. But Stephanie stiffened. She hated being corrected, especially by people she already decided were trouble. "It scanned $2.99, that's what it is," she said curtly. Miss Thelma smiled patiently. "I understand, dear. I just saw the price tag myself. Maybe it wasn't updated in the system?" Behind them, the line was growing. Stephanie's jaw tightened. "Look, I don't have time for this. If you can't afford it, maybe you shouldn't shop here." The words hung in the air like smoke. The older woman blinked, stunned. 1 or 2 people in line shifted uncomfortably. Then Stephanie did the unthinkable. As Miss Thelma reached forward to retrieve her items, Stephanie swatted her hand away, sharply like one might bat away an insect. The old woman stumbled slightly, more from shock than force, and dropped her tote bag. Silence fell over the store. For 2 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then someone said softly, "Did you just hit her?" Stephanie's face paled, but her pride surged stronger. "She was being aggressive," she snapped. "And I don't get paid to be harassed." Miss Thelma bent slowly to retrieve her bag, tears welling silently in her eyes, but her posture remained composed. She said nothing, though her eyes locked on Stephanie's with a calm, unsettling depth. "I'm leaving now," she said quietly, and walked out the door without another word. The bell jingled again, louder this time, as if the store itself understood something irreversible had occurred. 10 minutes later, the first video hit Facebook. A teenager in line had recorded the entire exchange. Within an hour, it had 800 shares. By lunch, it reached the inbox of every city council member in Elm Ridge. But the real earthquake didn't hit until evening, when the video was played on local news and a quiet statement followed from a powerful, unseen figure. "We do not condone violence against our elders, especially not from those entrusted with representing our name." Stephanie had no idea what that meant. Not yet. But her manager called her after her shift, his voice tight. "We need to talk, immediately." And across town, in a quiet, spacious home on the hill overlooking Elm Ridge, the real owner of Gold Market Grocery, Miss Thelma Dupree, sat in silence, staring at her untouched tea, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady and unreadable. The same sun that had warmed the grocery store that morning now sank in the west, casting long orange shadows across the quiet streets of Elm Ridge, though inside Thelma Dupree's modest but elegant home, time seemed to stand still. The scent of chamomile tea filled the air, untouched on the tray beside her, and beside the fireplace sat a large envelope marked "Emergency Only," sealed years ago but untouched until tonight. Miss Thelma, though quiet in public and humble in demeanor, was not a woman to be underestimated. Beneath her calm exterior lay decades of struggle, resilience, and strategic power that few could guess by her modest shoes or soft voice. Born in 1946, she had been raised by grandparents who had survived Jim Crow and whispered their wisdom like sacred scripture, and she had carried their lessons through decades of subtle warfare, in boardrooms, community halls, and courtrooms that didn't want her to exist in them, let alone speak. Her wealth had been quietly built through a series of wise investments, first a cleaning business that serviced City Hall, then a partnership in a real estate firm with her late husband, Robert, who passed in '97, and later a small trust fund set up in her grandson's name, which, through compound interest and good timing, had grown into something far greater. And yet she never boasted, never changed her habits, still walked to the store, still attended First Baptist, still made pound cake for the church fundraiser. Few knew that among her investments were 3 convenience stores, 2 laundromats, and, most notably, the building and land on which Gold Market Grocery operated. The franchise had approached her 10 years ago to lease the space, and she had agreed under strict terms, managed through a shell company and an intermediary firm to avoid attention. It wasn't secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was strategy, a way to preserve influence without attracting the resentment that often followed a successful black woman in a white town. But now that anonymity had a cost. The slap, small in gesture but massive in implication, had traveled like lightning through every thread of her community. Her neighbor Sandra had called in tears, offering to organize a protest. Her pastor left a voicemail saying he'd clear the pulpit for her if she wanted to speak. Even her great-niece Kendra, who rarely called except for birthdays and loan requests, had posted a furious Instagram video calling the store a nest of racism and elder abuse. But Thelma had said nothing yet. She didn't speak in haste. She had seen too much, endured too long to act from anger alone. Still, tonight she felt the old weight return to her chest. Not of helplessness, but of responsibility, the quiet burden that came with being both witness and warrior. She rose slowly and opened the envelope. Inside was a file containing property deeds, lease agreements, and a contract clause that had been inserted at her insistence years ago. One that gave her the right to terminate the lease immediately if the company violated any ethics standards, including harassment or discrimination of any kind. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of power reawakening in her blood. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Mr. Velasquez?" she said calmly when the line answered. "Yes, this is Thelma Dupree. I need to activate Clause 7B in the Gold Market lease." There was a pause, then an audible shift in tone. "Understood," the attorney said. "Would you like me to send the notice tonight?" "Yes," she replied. "Email, certified mail, and hand delivery, and copy me on all of it." Meanwhile, across town, Stephanie Monroe sat on her couch, the glow of her phone illuminating her pale face. Comments and messages flooded her inbox. Some cursed her out with hashtags. Others, strangers, co-workers, even distant cousins, tried to excuse her behavior. Her manager, Brian, had told her to take unpaid leave until this blows over, but he hadn't sounded confident. And then came the email, marked urgent lease action, forwarded from corporate to all staff. She stared in disbelief. Effective immediately, Gold Market Grocery's Elm Ridge location will close pending lease termination and internal review. She read the line 5 times before her brain caught up. "What the hell?" she whispered. She Googled the building's ownership and stared at the results with growing horror. Dupree Holdings, LLC. She recognized the last name. "No," she muttered aloud. "No way." But yes, way. Miss Thelma Dupree, the same woman she had belittled, dismissed, and struck in front of witnesses, owned not just the land under the store, but effectively the fate of Stephanie's employment and reputation. Her breath grew shallow. She remembered the old woman's calm, unblinking stare after the slap. That wasn't submission. That was something else. Power, legacy, and vengeance. Not the emotional, burning kind, but the cold, patient kind that waits years for the right time to bloom. Stephanie began to cry, not because she felt remorse, at least not yet, but because she realized for the first time that everything she had assumed about Miss Thelma had been wrong. She hadn't hit a frail old lady. She had insulted an institution. At First Baptist Church the next Sunday, Miss Thelma arrived in her usual floral hat and matching purse. She sat in the second pew as always, nodding politely, humming softly. But people looked at her differently now, with reverence, with quiet awe, some even with fear. When Pastor Green mentioned her in his sermon, "Let no one despise your age, for the elders among us hold the keys to our community's spirit and strength," the congregation rose in spontaneous applause. Miss Thelma didn't smile. She simply bowed her head, folded her hands, and mouthed a single word that only she heard. Justice. But justice, she knew, was never complete. Not in a day, not in a headline, not even in a lease termination. What had happened to her was a symptom, not a cause. And so, as she left the church that day and heard the whispers of news cameras waiting outside, she made another quiet decision. This wouldn't end with a store closure. It would end with change, real, institutional, public. It would end with voices being heard and systems being rebuilt. And if that meant stepping out of her carefully cultivated anonymity, then so be it. Because sometimes, legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you choose to expose while you're still alive. The days that followed unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche, each hour adding weight to the story that had already gripped not just Elm Ridge, but now the county and even regional media, with headlines like "Elderly Woman Assaulted by Store Clerk Owns the Store, Responds Swiftly, and Justice Wears a Sunday Hat." Reporters stood outside the shuttered doors of Gold Market Grocery, their breath fogging up the camera lenses as they filmed live segments speculating about lawsuits, boycotts, and a possible citywide investigation into employee conduct at chain franchises. But in the quiet nerve center of it all, Thelma Dupree remained composed and deliberate, rejecting most interview requests while gathering a small circle of advisors, 2 retired attorneys, 1 city councilwoman, and her grandson Marcus, who had just finished his MBA and returned home that summer. "They think this is about one slap," Marcus had said, scrolling through comment threads online. "They have no idea this is about 50 years of silencing women like you, Grandma." She had nodded slowly, sipping tea without sugar. "Then let's make sure they learn." Her next step was as unexpected as it was brilliant. She held a public meeting. Not a protest, not a press conference, but a town hall at the Elm Ridge Community Center, open to all, moderated by the respected pastor of the multi-denominational church across town. Flyers went up, local radio stations buzzed, and speculation bloomed like wildfire. People wondered if she'd cry, rage, file a lawsuit, or retreat into the quiet anonymity most people expected of elderly women. Instead, when the folding chairs filled up on that cool Friday evening and the room settled into silence, Thelma stepped to the microphone in a gray skirt suit and low heels, her posture erect, her voice clear as rain. "I didn't come here tonight to discuss what was done to me," she began. "I came to discuss what's been done to all of us, and what we've allowed to go unnoticed." She spoke for 20 minutes, about dignity, about workplace abuse, about racial microaggressions that had become so common they went unchallenged, and about the quiet tyranny of low expectations placed on people who looked or aged like her. But she didn't stop there. She read names, anonymous at first, of workers who had contacted her in the last week to describe their own stories of mistreatment by franchise managers, including Stephanie Monroe's past outbursts that had never been formally reported for fear of retaliation. Some were women, some were immigrants, and many were just trying to survive in a system that viewed them as disposable. "This," Thelma said, holding up a copy of the Gold Market Employee Handbook, "says you have rights, but it only works if the people in charge actually enforce them. And when they don't, when they look away, when they review and assess instead of acting, then it's up to us to step in and remind them who really owns what." The applause that followed shook the walls. Even the mayor, who had slipped in quietly at the back of the room, found himself standing involuntarily. Thelma nodded once, slowly, then added, "Let this be clear. I'm not suing to get money. I already have money. I'm not here to tear things down. I'm here to rebuild them with honesty. And if you're with me, we start tonight." From that moment forward, the town shifted. Petitions formed not just to re-examine Gold Market's training practices, but to institute mandatory anti-discrimination and elder sensitivity programs across all retail outlets in the county. Local teachers began using the story as a case study in ethics discussions. A group of young volunteers created an online watchdog platform called Silent No More, Elm Ridge. And within a month, 3 other retail franchises in nearby towns faced internal investigations based on testimonies submitted through it. But perhaps most significantly, Thelma announced her plans to convert the now vacant grocery building into a new cooperative market, owned and operated by local workers, with full transparency in wages, treatment, and policy enforcement. Stephanie Monroe, meanwhile, was left adrift in a storm she could neither control nor spin away. Fired formally within days of the video going viral, and with job offers drying up faster than the internet's memory could erase her name, she issued a public apology, but not directly to Miss Thelma. It was vague, legal-sounding, and meant more for damage control than healing. "I regret the events that transpired," she wrote. "They do not reflect my values." But the community wasn't interested in regrets without accountability. Thelma, for her part, never acknowledged the statement. She didn't need to. She had already made her position clear. This was no longer about personal forgiveness, but public restoration. And that restoration required more than words. It required action. As summer faded into fall and the air turned crisp, the new cooperative began renovations. Local painters were hired to reimagine the drab aisles with murals celebrating community elders. A small memorial bench was installed in front of the store, engraved with the words, "Respect is the currency of every generation." Miss Thelma attended the groundbreaking ceremony, but gave the speech over to her grandson Marcus, watching from a chair beneath an umbrella as he addressed the crowd with pride in his voice and tears in his eyes. "My grandmother taught me that silence is not always golden," he said. "Sometimes it's just the sound of injustice winning. Today, we break that silence." When the applause died down, Miss Thelma stood once more, not as a victim, not just as an owner, but as a pillar, and whispered to Marcus, "This is only the beginning." Because it was. What had begun as a casual cruelty from a clerk had become a catalyst. And Section 1 of this story closed not with a courtroom verdict or a viral post, but with a question carried on the wind through Elm Ridge and beyond. What do we owe the people who built the very ground we stand on? And better yet, what happens when they stand up again, this time on their own terms? By the time the first frost settled over Elm Ridge, the town had split into 3 quiet factions. Those who supported Miss Thelma wholeheartedly and saw her as a symbol of justice long denied. Those who bristled at the wave of change and whispered about overreaction and cancellations gone too far. And a small but growing group in the middle, watching everything unfold with equal parts awe and discomfort, unsure which way to lean. The community cooperative grocery project, now dubbed the People's Market, had stirred something dormant in the town, not just debate, but reflection. For the first time in decades, conversations about ownership, labor, dignity, and race crossed into spaces that had been silent before. PTA meetings, barbershops, coffee counters at the diner where old men read newspapers and rarely made eye contact with people who didn't look like them. Even the church pews buzzed differently. Thelma had become more than a figurehead. She had become a force, one that people wanted something from. Endorsement, partnership, explanation, absolution. Invitations to speak poured in from civic groups, universities, women's organizations, and television shows, some offering honorariums and first-class travel, but Thelma accepted only two. One was a sit-down interview with a local black journalist she'd mentored 20 years ago. The other was a town-wide community teach-in organized by her grandson Marcus, now the interim director of the People's Market. Marcus, for all his education and credentials, found himself stepping into his grandmother's shadow with both pride and pressure. He admired her clarity and moral stamina, but he was also painfully aware of how heavy that legacy now sat on his own shoulders. Every decision he made, from contractor hiring to how to respond to a snarky op-ed in the Elm Ridge Gazette, was filtered through the public's expectation of the Dupree standard. It wasn't fair, but fairness had never been part of their family story. Only duty. Meanwhile, Stephanie Monroe had vanished from public life. Rumors spread that she had moved in with a cousin in Jackson or was staying in a motel in the next county over. Online, her name was now associated with over 2 million hits, most negative, and the once bored cashier now found herself locked out of future employment by the very anonymity she used to mock in customers like Thelma. The corporate office of Gold Market Grocery had sent a formal apology, pledged a $50,000 donation to elder abuse programs, and launched a PR campaign that failed to gain traction. Most of the town saw it as performative. Real accountability, it seemed, was being led not by corporations but by community elders. But all change has a cost, and Thelma was beginning to feel it. Her quiet life of solitude and routine was gone, replaced by a dizzying array of requests, decisions, and expectations. Her neighbors now deferred to her in grocery aisles, some treating her like royalty, others with hesitant distance, unsure how to behave. Her mornings were no longer for tea and gardening, but for interviews, budget meetings, and protest planning. Even her sanctuary, her church, had begun to shift. The older deacons, mostly men, bristled at how the spotlight followed her now, some refusing to shake her hand after Sunday service, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Pastor Green noticed it too, and one evening after Bible study, he invited her into his office and closed the door softly behind them. "Sister Dupree," he said gently, "you've done something extraordinary, but I'd be lying if I said it hasn't caused ripples." Thelma looked him dead in the eye. Justice always causes ripples. Silence causes sinkholes. He didn't disagree, but he sighed. "Some folks are asking whether this is still a house of God or a house of protest." She tilted her head. "If it's only one, Reverend, then it was never a house of God to begin with." And with that, she stood and left, the sound of her cane tapping against the tile echoing louder than her words. But that night, for the first time in months, she sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself to feel the cost. Not regret, never regret, but weariness. She missed her anonymity, her walks, her peace. She missed being someone's grandmother, not everyone's symbol. She thought of her late husband Robert, who used to say, "Legacy is just the echo of work done right." Would he have been proud? Certainly. But would he have urged her to rest? Probably. And yet, she could not stop. Not now. Because beyond the headlines and hashtags, there were people counting on her. A young single mother named Alicia had approached her at the market site, tears in her eyes, saying she'd been afraid to speak up when her boss had touched her inappropriately at her last job. "But seeing you stand up," Alicia whispered, "you made me feel like I could do it too." That was worth more than any apology. Months passed, and with the soft return of spring came a gentler rhythm to Elm Ridge, a calm after the storm that didn't erase what had happened, but allowed its lessons to settle like seeds in fresh soil. The People's Market was now thriving, with murals of community elders on its walls, locally sourced produce lining its shelves, and a staff that reflected the diversity the old store had quietly suppressed. Miss Thelma Dupree no longer attended every meeting or supervised every detail. She had stepped back, not out, and could often be found on her porch, sipping mint tea, tending to her garden, or reading quietly, finally able to reclaim the stillness that had once been stolen by injustice. Marcus had grown into his leadership role with grace and vision, expanding the store's mission to include workshops, mentorship programs, and an internship for at-risk youth. People who once passed Miss Thelma without a glance now stopped to greet her with respect, not because she had demanded it, but because she had proven that quiet does not mean weak, and age does not mean irrelevant. One afternoon, a young woman approached her outside the market, a high school student named Brielle, eyes bright, notebook in hand. "Miss Thelma," she said nervously, "I'm doing a paper for school and I picked you as my subject. My teacher said we had to write about a local figure who changed history. Can I ask you a few questions?" Thelma smiled gently, nodding, though a part of her still felt strange at the word history, as if her life had somehow moved from real time into the pages of something larger. "You can ask me anything, child," she replied. Brielle sat beside her and asked, "What was the hardest part of everything that happened?" Thelma thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the sidewalk where she once walked every day without being noticed. "The hardest part," she said slowly, "was not the slap. It was realizing how many people had seen me every day and never truly seen me at all. It wasn't pain that hurt, it was invisibility." Brielle scribbled in her notebook, "The silence stretching tenderly between generations." "And what was the most important part?" Thelma smiled again, this time with warmth behind it. "That I didn't let bitterness decide who I was going to be next." The market's bell rang in the distance, the sound echoing with familiarity, and for a brief moment, Thelma remembered the morning it all began, the touch of sun through the window, the weight of a coin purse in her palm, the sting not of skin, but of humiliation. And then she let the memory go, not in denial, but in peace, because its purpose had already been fulfilled. Stephanie Monroe had not been heard from since her quiet exit, though there were rumors she'd moved up north, started over, changed her name. Thelma never spoke of her again, not out of spite, but because dwelling in the past only had power if it helped grow the future. One Sunday at church, Pastor Green invited Thelma to speak, and she declined, choosing instead to simply sit in the pew, hand resting on her cane, heart full. When service ended, the congregation stood in a spontaneous gesture, not applause, but stillness, reverence, as if recognizing not a hero, but a truth they'd finally been ready to see. The town didn't become perfect, racism didn't vanish, class divides didn't magically dissolve, but something had undeniably shifted. The students at Elm Ridge High now studied the People's Market case in their civics class. The city council added a community advisory board with seats reserved for elders and minority voices. And in the local museum, a new exhibit had opened. Power in Plain Sight, the legacy of Thelma Dupree. In its center stood a single object, a worn floral tote bag, gently folded under glass. Miss Thelma visited the exhibit only once, alone, early in the morning before the crowds. She stood before the display for a long time, her eyes misting but her spine straight. Then she whispered, to no one and to everyone, "I never needed a pedestal. I just needed a place." And with that she turned, stepped into the morning light, and walked slowly, steadily, back into a town that had finally learned how to see her.